Hi there, and welcome to The Artist's Craft. I am your host, Stacey Cochran. We have an outstanding author joining us in studio today. Randi Davenport is the director for the Center of Undergraduate Excellence at UNC Chapel Hill. She earned her MA in creative writing and her PhD in literature from Syracuse University. Her short fiction and essays have appeared in the Washington Post, the Ontario Review, the Alaska Quarterly Review, and Literature Film Quarterly. Her memoir, The Boy Who Loved Tornadoes, was published by Algonquin Books in March, and it is a heck of a read. Thank you very much for joining us in studio today.
Thanks very much for having me, Stacey.
Well, tell us a little bit about the inspiration for the book for folks watching at home. What's the story about? What made you want to write it?
So this is a story about my son, and it's also about our family. My son experienced a number of developmental difficulties when he was a young boy, all of which were very difficult for doctors to diagnose. And I worked very hard to help him grow up normally and grow up in a family where he didn't feel like he was an exceptional child. But it was an enormous struggle because we didn't have a name or a label for whatever it was that was going wrong for him. And when he was 15, he had a tremendous and significant psychotic break from which he did not really return. He entered into a world of really unremitting psychosis. And that story led to, or that event led to my having to struggle here in the state of North Carolina to find services for him, appropriate care. Now, I'd always struggled to some extent to find services for him and did the best I could. But when he entered into the state psychiatric system, I really discovered how little care is available, especially for someone with a severe and serious and long-standing chronic mental illness, that's just not something that you can easily address under the system that's available in the state today. His case was complicated because he has a developmental disability as well as a psychiatric diagnosis in the state of North Carolina. You need to be one or the other. You need to either have a psychiatric diagnosis, what we'd say an MI diagnosis, or a DD, a developmental disability diagnosis. You can't be both if you want to get services. Unfortunately, he had both. So the book really is about him, and so it's a love story. It's about my daughter, so it's a love story, and it's about our family, so it's a love story. But it also, I think, explores with as much integrity as I could possibly bring to the question what it means to try to care for somebody in a society that stigmatizes the illness that he has.
Well, that's one of the things that really stands out to me as truly remarkable about The Boy Who Loved Tornadoes is the compassion with which this story was written. Certainly there's anger on the page too, but it's not a story that's, I think, bitter, cynical, or jaded. Can you talk about how you approach a story which no doubt you have a lot of anger and frustration about, and portray it in a way that does have compassion basically underlying it?
Yeah, well, obviously I have compassion for my son, but I think you're right when you say I have compassion for the people who are inside the system and the doctors and everyone who, another writer or another parent might have said, well, they just failed my son, or they're our son. In my case, I really wanted to give a fair and balanced picture of the struggles that those people, there are many people doing very good work and trying their best. They too are hamstrung by the kinds of restrictions that the system places on them. So it wasn't fair, I thought, to personalize it or to single out individuals and say, aha, you're the source of the trouble. The source of the trouble is much broader than any one person.
How long did it take to write the memoir?
I started in 2004. I tricked myself into writing it. I didn't plan to write this book. I thought I was going to write a very brief piece for The Independent about healthcare reform, mental health reform in the state of North Carolina. And during that year, there's a lot of public conversation. Thought I would use our family as an example of what families struggle with. Went up to the mountains, sat in a cabin for a week. At the end of the week, I had 100 pages. And I thought, well, that's not a piece for The Independent, a little too long for what they will publish. But also, I realized I had a lot more to say. So I worked in increments over a period of probably 3.5 years, working on it and coming to it and leaving it and returning to it. And trying very hard not to tell myself that it was a book, just telling myself I was going to tell the story in the most truthful way I knew how, and then I would see where I was when I thought I was finished.
Obviously, it's a very painful story. It's an excruciatingly painful story to have to relive in a book. What kept you motivated as you were writing it off and on over the course of that 3 or 4 years?
Well, I think it's because it was our story and Chase's story, and I thought, when I was struggling in the deepest reaches of this experience, I felt very isolated, very lonely in the experience of trying to care for a child with a severe illness, and I didn't find any other voice out there, a book that I could turn to, something that would give me some solace and comfort. And as this began to take shape, I thought, this is a book that will maybe offer somebody else the kind of hope that I didn't find when I was in the middle of it. And if so, then that's why I want to do it. And so that kept me going, this idea that it might be helpful to other people, that there wasn't another telling of this story that I knew of anyway out there. I mean, there may have been other books by parents of children with mental illness, but not this story. And so I thought, well, I'm going to write it for folks who are struggling and whose voices go unheard.
So having this kind of knowledge, experience about the mental health care system in the state of North Carolina and as well in the Midwest, although the extreme part that you focus on in the book here really took place here in North Carolina, what kinds of reform, what kinds of changes do we need to see in the treatment of severely mentally ill kids and adults as well, I would imagine?
Right. My son's 22 now, so he's now an adult in the system as opposed to a child entering into the system. And you'll be surprised to hear me say that there are a couple of different kinds of things that we need to work on that don't start with money first. The first thing we need to do is decide as a society that we are going to not stigmatize these illnesses, and that we are going to treat them the way we treat any other illness that a human being might experience. So, if you have a bad kidney and it starts having symptoms, and you go to the doctor and the doctor identifies those symptoms and says, oh, you've got some trouble with your kidney, we don't throw you out on the street. We don't say, fend for yourself with your kidney disease. We don't say, you're a terrible person because you have kidney disease. We don't tell you that you are defective because you have kidney disease. Mental illness is quite apart from that. In the world of mental illness, someone who has a malfunctioning brain begins to experience symptoms, and those symptoms are invariably met with the kind of regard that you would give to someone who is morally defective or has a moral flaw. A paucity of Christian virtue is one of the ways that I describe it in the book. But it comes from a long held set of beliefs in Western society. So I don't know how we intervene in that, except to say that people like me who have experiences and have the ability to speak up need to speak up more and more, and there are lots of people doing that. There are a lot of families living in the shadows because they're still ashamed and still frightened, and still it's very hard to come forward. It's very hard for people to identify themselves as having this experience in their family. I get a lot of questions these days from interviewers who say, well, it's very brave of you, or weren't you afraid to tell the story? And that question makes me angry because, of course, I'm not afraid to tell the story of my child who got sick. What they're focusing on is that my child has mental illness, and that somehow or another is too taboo of a subject. So that's too big of a task for one person, but we all need to start working on it. And the other piece, of course, does have to do with making certain that this illness is treated like any other illness in terms of funding models, and that we don't balance the budget on the backs of people who are getting services in the Department of Health and Human Services, which has in fact been the case in recent years. That's the first place cuts are made, it seems.
Well, one of the things, I don't want to give away too much about the book. Again, we are talking with Randi Davenport. She's the author of The Boy Who Loved Tornadoes, which I think is one of the best memoirs I've read, period, and so check it out. One of the things that stands out to me in the heart of the story is your son's time at the hospital in Chapel Hill, and when the funding for that came to an end, he was basically, the way you describe it in the book, is he was forced into a state hospital with kids who were in this hospital because of criminal and deviant acts, and yet he had done nothing wrong. He did nothing wrong.
He did nothing wrong, right? Yeah, and I think that was one of the most shocking moments in our journey together. Was certainly I thought, well, I've got good health care, and so he's going to be okay. He's going to be taken care of. And the insurance company felt that he'd been on an acute care crisis stabilization unit for 7.5 months, that was far too long for someone to need acute care. He really needed acute care, and that's why he was there. But they said, no, that can't possibly be true, so we're going to stop paying for his care and treatment at that hospital. So off he went into a state psychiatric hospital, and that particular experience was frightening, because I think the folks at that hospital did a wonderful job, but it is the case that he was very far from my reach. Very difficult for me to know what was going on day to day with him. Certainly the social workers did everything they could to keep me cued in, but when he was at UNC Memorial, I could visit him on the unit. When he was in the state system, I had to visit him in a locked room, and I never saw where he lived except for one afternoon where his bed was and how he was being cared for and so on. So I was held outside of his care while he was in the state system in a way that I wasn't at Memorial. So I think those things are scary for a parent. They were certainly scary for me. And the other thing that I talk about in the book is that, yes, those kids that he was placed with are kids who have long criminal records. Many of them, this is the last stop before something like prison. But I don't necessarily assume that those kids don't need intense mental health care. Very often those criminal acts, what we might deem criminal acts, are coming out of a context that you and I might find unbelievable in terms of the development of mental illness that has gone untreated, and then the kid does something wrong and we say, oh look, he's a deviant. Well, he might be, but he might really just be a person who's sick and needs some help.
Can you describe what your emotional state was during that period when he was at the state hospital in Butner and you couldn't even see his room? Where were you at emotionally at that point? Well,
it was a very, very hard time because I had been accustomed to being very involved in his care and wanting very much to do everything I could to alleviate his suffering and to make certain that he was getting good care. And so I think I must have driven the social workers a little bit crazy, because I kept calling and complaining that I couldn't see him, or that it was difficult sometimes for me to know what was happening with him. So for my emotional state, I guess I would say at that moment in the story, I felt desolate. I also was under the pressure, of course, of finding him long-term care at that moment. He was in that hospital. He needed to go someplace. They weren't going to keep him. He was a person with a developmental disability in a psychiatric facility. And as you know, there have been lawsuits in the state of North Carolina that say you can't care for somebody with a DD diagnosis for long-term in a psychiatric hospital. So, I was desperate to find him a place where he would get appropriate services and appropriate care for the long haul, and very devastated by the fact that his illness had not abated. And I think I focused on the fact that he was still suffering more than I focused on almost anything else.
The author is Randi Davenport. The book is The Boy Who Loved Tornadoes. It's a memoir. Check it out. It's, again, one of the most powerful memoirs I've read, and it's excruciating to imagine what you went through. I can't even imagine what it was actually like. Well, let's talk about a little bit about the process of writing. We'll shift it towards that a little bit. Our audience for these interviews, a lot of folks are aspiring writers, folks who might have a memoir in mind. How did you decide what scenes to include in the book, and how many scenes ended up on the cutting room floor that you deleted afterwards?
Quite a lot. When I turned the manuscript into Algonquin, it was nearly 600 pages long. And so the very first thing that we had to do was start cutting and trimming and being certain that that I chose carefully about what scenes to include and what scenes to leave out. So, I think during the writing process, I allowed myself to go where my heart took me and to speak as authentically as I could, and I also gave myself permission to write anything down that seemed that was coming to mind. You know, many writers censor themselves even in the act of writing. They look at a sentence and they say, it's not good enough, and I need to write that sentence times before I write the next sentence. Whereas I think you need to free yourself and allow the voice that wants to come out to come out. You can work on the sentences themselves later, but you need to allow yourself the freedom to speak your truth. And so in that way, I think the story just built itself a little bit at a time. It also did not have this narrative structure. You know, it has the interlocking narratives right now. It was originally written, my first draft was to focus on various issues that Chase had experienced. And it made a lot of sense when an agent suggested to me that maybe I revise to do a more chronological layout of the narrative, that would make it more accessible to readers. I thought that was really wonderful advice at the point that came. But that required, again, more revision. I can't tell you how many drafts. This has been through many, many drafts. But each time I passed through it, I think the book was strengthened for that work. And I think so many writers think that, you know, they're going to write it down once and there it is. Or if you're a little bit further along in the development of your craft, you think you might write it 3 or 4 times and there it is. But you write it along a lot in order to get it to the final sort of what you hold in your hands today.
Well, one of the nice things about the book in terms of style is the interlocking story like you're talking about, where you know, where the focus is on Chase for a chapter and then you shift to your daughter, and it's like, okay, there's this other life that you have to, you know, live as well. Can you talk about almost the duality of having, you know, a son who is severely mentally ill, and then the reality of having a daughter as well who's in all, you know, aspects normal.
Right, caught in the family tempest, as we say. You know, she was in the whirlwind, and I think the difficult thing during that time was how thin I was spread and how little of me there was to go around. And I know that I refer to her at some point in the book as a distant star, not much gazed upon. And I think that's an apt metaphor for what she must have experienced. Her mother was in her life, but her mother was constantly focused on ambulances that came in the nighttime, or seizures that happened, or psychotic behavior, or phone calls from school, or from psychiatrists, or from people who said, you know, we identified these problems in Chase. It was not my intention, of course, and perhaps in some ways her story is harder to write because I know she was a person who did not get all of me the way that I would have wanted her to. But she's doing really great, and she's 18 now, and she's about to go off to college. And I think growing up in this particular storm has probably shaped her and given her some strengths that kids her age don't typically have. But I'm so proud of her and the fact that she was able to come through this so well. I think her horseback riding is a big part of that. People say to me, well, it was your mothering, but I think it was her horseback riding. But trying to write the story so that her life story came to life, so that the past that so informed the present was available to the reader. That's where the interlocking narratives came into play.
Well, the author is Randi Davenport. The book, again, is The Boy Who Loved Tornadoes. There's just so much we could talk about with the book. It sounds like one of the things that folks who might have, and it's amazing how many people do have mental illness in their families, but one of the things that's kind of unanticipated is just how disruptive it is to the rest of the family. As I was reading this, as I was reading the memoir, I was struck by how little anger comes through regarding your ex-husband and his absence from your life and Chase's life and your daughter's life as well during this period. There doesn't seem to be any anger.
Right.
Was that just you were kind of not going to display it in the book?
It's just going to hold back, right? Not tell the truth? No. It's in fact the case that I see him as an individual who has experienced untreated mental illness. And just as you would not yell at a person in a wheelchair to get up and walk, because you just can if you just try, you wouldn't yell at somebody who has an untreated mental illness for showing signs of difficulty in his own life. And certainly that was our experience as a family, that he disappeared into his own world and I think suffered quite a bit. And so it seemed not just unnecessary, but not real, not true to the story. I wasn't angry at him. I'm still not angry at him. I understand.
I think that's the measure of really, to me anyways, that's the measure of really quality work, is somebody who can approach something like that. I don't know how you would do it, honestly. I think I would be angry. I think most people would be bitter at the absence. How much do you think his absence contributed to this break that's really displayed in the book that you talk about in the book?
Yeah, that's a hard question to answer. I don't know that it contributed, and I don't know that it didn't contribute. I think that there were a stew of things that Chase was forced to deal with, just in terms of the emotional context of our family. Obviously losing his father, having his father go missing was a big blow. I certainly think that the struggles he had with his neck injury, big blow. I think the seizures that he experienced that were so disruptive to his life, a huge blow for a young boy. I think the fact that we relocated so I could find services for him, I think was very difficult. I think at the heart, though, what you have is a brain that has begun to not function entirely the way you would want a brain to function. And, you know, people could debate the causes of that for a long time. I think I come down on the side of neurosciences and think of the brain as an organ that has symptoms and issues that are unique to it. I don't give it any special status. We tend to, in our society, think that our brains, because we think with them, are some kind of special organ, but I tend not to do that.
One of the most painful scenes to read about, and certainly probably to relive, comes pretty early in the book, when your son is asking you to perform a mercy killing of him. That's the kind of torment he was in that we're talking about here.
Yeah, and he looked to me to help him stop the pain, and it was it was a very hard moment. It was a very hard moment.
Did you ever wish that you could go back and not have had a son?
A son or this son? What's your question?
This son.
Yeah, no, I never went back and wished I could have another child and not this child. This is a love story. I love my children and I love my son. And I think it's really important for people who have not experienced mental illness or autism in their families to recognize that these are not labels and diagnoses and illnesses walking around among us. These are our loved ones. These are our children. These are our brothers and sisters. These are our husbands and wives. These are our parents. These are the people we love.
So knowing what he's suffered in his life, if you had it to do over, you'd do it the same way.
Well, I don't welcome the suffering that he's had, and I certainly don't think that that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that if I don't hold myself responsible for what happened to him either. I guess I would say that I would never replace this extraordinary, beautiful child with another.
For folks who have a family member that they're dealing with, maybe not issues exactly like this, because each case is different, what kinds of suggestions would you offer, give them for the kinds of frustrations that they might be going through with the system, trying to get the right kind of treatment and care?
Yeah, there are a number of things. I mean, the first thing that they might do is recognize that they're going to have to fight for services and for care, and they're not going to be able to let up. They're going to have to be persistent and show a lot of determination, and they're going to want to make allies within the system. They're going to want to talk to everybody and anyone they can who they think might be able to be helpful. They're not going to want to take no for an answer. They're going to hear no a lot, but they're not going to want to take no for an answer. I think they're going to take advantage of the resources that the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill offer. You know, that organization, which is nationwide, has county by county chapters. and tremendous resources, and people can turn to them for help. If they're struggling with a child who also has a developmental disability diagnosis, like autism, as my son did and does, they can turn to organizations like the Autism Society of America, and again, statewide chapters across the country that can provide support and peer-to-peer counseling. That's certainly true for NAMI as well, and provide all kinds of resources, but it won't be enough. That those agencies, as good as they are and as hard as they work, that won't be enough. They're going to have to be willing and able to rise out of themselves at this time of great need and devastation, when their loved one is suffering the most, is when they're going to need to do this. And they're going to need to just keep hammering at the doors and saying, please help me. The state needs to help me. The state has a mandate to help, and not take no for an answer.
With regard to the book, how did you know when it was done? How did you know that you had an ending? And are you satisfied with the ending that you have now?
Well, the story is ongoing. My son is still alive and still here, and things turn on a dime, and he's doing very, very well. And I think he's proof of the fact that good services and therapeutic interventions and proper programming for individuals with appropriate medication support can do just amazing things for people with severe mental illness. You hear all the time that once somebody has become severely ill, that there's no recovery and there's no retrieving them. And he's obviously still ill, but he's not nearly as ill as he was a few years back. So the story is still ongoing. I think I knew the story was over when we reached that point where he had reached harbor, safe harbor. I think when he was in a program where I was certain he was going to be well cared for, and that there were services that were going to help him, which has in fact turned out to be true. I mean, it's an amazing place that he lives, and the services are great, but they're in the state of North Carolina. Only 12 young men can take advantage of those services out of our millions.
A lot needs to be done.
A lot needs to be done.
We're coming down to our last 30 seconds or so. How important is perseverance as a writer?
Absolutely, 100% the most important thing. It's, just show up day after day after day after day and put some words on the paper and just keep going. And even when you doubt yourself, keep going. And even when you think that you'll never be any good, keep going. And even when you think that you're the best thing in the world, keep going. Don't let anything throw you off, but just keep going. I've been writing my whole life. And the fact of the matter is that the only thing that writers do is write. They don't talk about writing. They don't go to writers' conferences to hear other people talk about writing. They write. You need to apply the seat of the pants to the chair and write. So
very quickly, how does it feel to finally see a book published in print?
Extraordinary. It's an absolutely extraordinary experience. I don't think that anything in my life compares to this, because it's a dream that I've had since I was 8 years old. And so it's absolutely incredible to have it come true.
Well, the author is Randi Davenport. The memoir that we've been talking about is The Boy Who Loved Tornadoes, published with Algonquin Books here in North Carolina. It's available, nationwide and I presume worldwide before too long here. Check it out now, because everybody's going to be talking about this book in 2010. Randi, thank you very much for joining us here on The Artist's Craft.
Thank you so much for having me and helping me share the story.
Very cool. And for all of us here at The Artist's Craft, Michael and Marnie working hard in the back, the folks over in Master Control, I want to thank you for tuning in. Thanks so much. So we'll roll credits.